Welcome to episode 3 of Embroider on Your Clothes. In the first episode, I talked about the materials you need and different techniques for transferring your pattern to your item of clothing. In the second episode, I went over a variety of basic embroidery stitches that you can use when creating your design. Now it's time for the fun part. In this episode, I'll start stitching one of the designs and talk a little bit about embroidery and where you can find more designs. Let's get started. I'm going to be adding a design to this shirt, and I'm going to use this design with the books on it, which is very appropriate for a librarian. And I'm going to show you some of the stitches that I'll be using for this design. I like to trim some of the excess stabilizer off of the pattern. This is optional, but it does make it a little easier later when you are soaking your clothing to get rid of the stabilizer when you're finished stitching. Next, I'm going to peel the backing off and then place the design where I want to stitch it. So I'm going to put it right about here and just gently lay it down. I'm also using a embroidery hoop. This is optional. I do find it useful for keeping the material nice and taut while you're stitching. Now this design leaves lots of options for using the stitches you use and the colors you use. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to show you a few that I'm going to use on here. Mostly I'm going to be using satin stitch, which is going to be really nice to fill in these spines of these books. But I'm also going to use some stem stitch and some back stitch and a little bit of outline stitch, which is just back stitch to outline each of these books. Really makes them pop up from the design and really distinguish each spine. And then I'm going to decorate the pot. And again, there's many options available. That's up to you entirely. So I've pre-threaded some needles here to once they get going, you can just keep stitching. And I'm going to start with this green thread. I'm going to start with this first book here. And I think what I'm going to do is, first of all, make sure my material is nice and tight. This is nice and flat. As you're stitching, that will help keep your design in place. Right here at first, as we're starting, it might want to move a little bit. So I'm just going to do a simple satin stitch here. And I'm going to put contrasting decorations on the spine here. So I'm just doing relatively short satin stitches here. Now I'm going up and down. It would have also been interesting to make these go back and forth. In fact, I think that's what I'll do with the decorative part coming up here in a minute. So let me continue stitching here. And I'm going to go ahead and do the center section as well while I'm right here. I'm not too worried about the back of the piece, however long my stitches are. Sometimes embroidery is seen as very, very particular, very exacting, that the back needs to look as neat and tidy as the front. And I guess I'm from the school that's a little more relaxed. Embroidery is fun and enjoyable, and I'm not going to get too hung up on details like that. If you want to do that, of course, they're beautiful, by all means. Go ahead and do that. Okay. So now I'm going to flip to the back and I'm going to knot this off. And because it's on clothing, I'm going to knot it at least twice because it's going to get worn and used and probably thrown in the washing machine. So I'm going to put a couple knots in the back here. If you want to do more than a couple, I think that's probably not a bad idea also. So I'm just knotting it off like this. And then I'm also going to thread the tail under some stitches so it's not sticking out. So now I'm going to do the decorative parts of the spine here. And I'm going to go the opposite direction. So still satin stitch, but the opposite direction. And the nice thing about that is it kind of covers up or evens out that kind of uneven edge that I had. Okay, I'm going to do the next book here on this shelf, and I'm going to do the stem stitch with this. So I'm going to make them fairly long. So as you remember, you go forward and then you create that foundation stitch, and then you go about half the length of the foundation stitch forward, and then you bring it back in the middle of the previous stitch, your foundation stitch. There are a couple different ways to do this stitch. I wouldn't be surprised if there are multiple ways to do just about every embroidery stitch. I'm going to go ahead and just stitch over. You can see the design has drawn out here some decoration for that book, but I'm going to just stitch right over that, and I'll just try to remember when I come back here after I've finished stitching the book. Okay, so I finished filling that in with stem stitch. You can see it gives it a little bit of texture there. I also added just 2 little short straight stitches up here to make it look like a little bit of decoration on the spine there of the book. I also want to mention that I'm using 6 strands of embroidery floss here. So especially when you're filling in, using 6 strands helps it fill in quicker. But you can always use fewer strands if you'd like. So I'm going to tackle this next book here. And this one, I'm going to use chain stitch. We'll see how that works. So okay, you can see that I finished up this book spine using chain stitch, and then I added a little bit of satin stitch in the center there as the spine label or spine decoration, and you can see how that turned out. Quite frankly, I think I prefer the satin stitch look on these book spines, which I've started on this book already with more satin stitch, but it does create an interesting look and something a little different to try. So next you can see I've started on the shelf, and I'm just using a real simple back stitch. Try and keep my stitches even, which is kind of the hardest part about back stitch. Having mixed success with that. But I just did straight across on the first time, just normal back stitch. And now when I'm going back, I'm trying to alternate where I bring up my needle. So not in the they're not exactly parallel to each other, but kind of offset from the row above them. And this is called brick stitch. So it's really just back stitch, and it's just the way you place it. Now you could use several different kinds of stitches here. Stem stitch, like what I used up here for the red spine, would work really well. You could use chain stitch. You could also use a real narrow band of satin stitch. That would be real pretty too. I'm going to talk a little bit about doing more satin stitch up here for the plant. And I'm just going to show you how changing the direction can create a lot of movement and shape to your piece. So I just started at a point of one of the stems. I'm not sure what kind of plant this is, but started just at the point, and I'm just filling in that little triangle. I'm going to do this one right next, just one over from it. And both of these are kind of, I would say, in the front, the forefront here. So I've got the front leaves of the plant stitched, and now I'm going to do this one that's in the back. So just keeping the stitches behind or just short of the stitches that created the leaves for the front leaves. And that's how they look when they're finished. Now I'm going to go next with the outline stitch, and that's going to add even more depth to the little plant here. And I think also to the books, you'll see how some outline stitch really improves how they look. Okay, I'm going to show you the outline stitch now. And basically it's freeform backstitch, I guess you would say, or just freeform stitches. You make them as long as you want, cover as much territory as you want. Like other stitches, you probably don't want great big long stitches, especially on a piece of clothing. Those stitches might get loose or get caught on a piece of like your finger or a ring when you're putting the shirt or jacket on or off. But it's just what it sounds like. You're just outlining the various parts that you've already stitched with a contrasting color. I usually use a darker color to contrast it. Depends entirely on what you're stitching. So in this case I'm using dark brown, and I'm just outlining those leaves here. And as you can see, that helps distinguish the leaves in front from the ones in back. It seems like an extra step. It's usually the very last thing you want to do when you're stitching a pattern, and it seems like, oh, I'm done, I don't want to do anymore, but it can make such a huge difference in how the design looks. I am using 2 strands of floss for the outline stitch. You want something thinner, but you still want it to be able to show up. So the contrasting color, but fewer strands, so you can really get those details in. So for everything else, all the satin stitch and everything else that I did here, I used 6 strands of floss. But for this outline stitch, I'm just using 2. So here's what it looks like when one of the books is outlined. I chose to outline the decorations on the spine as well. You can or skip that if you want. So you can, it gives you an idea of what it might look like when they're all done. Now I did want to mention also that I suggested that you knot at least twice when you are knotting off on the back to help keep your stitching from unraveling when it's being, used, worn, put in the washing machine and so forth. You might also want to, if you're really concerned about that, you might also want to use a little piece of iron-on fusible interfacing. Real lightweight interfusing. Pellon makes several different weights, and including some real lightweight ones that are really good for using with fabric. In clothing like this, you might want to put a small piece on the back, and that will help secure the stitches. Of course, you want to do that after you've finished and after you've removed the stabilizer. And to do that, you would just remove, obviously, you want to remove the embroidery hoop. And also, obviously, you want to wait till you're completely finished. And then just dip, you don't even have to wash the whole thing, just dip this part, you're stitching where you've done some stitching. Just set it in a sink or a bowl of warm water. It doesn't have to be cold or hot, just something warm. And then I usually leave it to sit for maybe 10 minutes. And when I come back, most of it, this white stabilizer is gone. You might need to agitate it just a little bit to get more of the stabilizer off, but it should come off real easily without too much effort at all. And then when you're done with that, I suggest that you're going to want to dry it, of course, and after it's dried, you'll want to iron it. Careful, you don't want to iron it flat on the surface, but especially if it's still damp, because I get impatient and don't always wait for it to dry completely, but I will very carefully with the point of the iron around the surface as much as I can. But then what you're going to want to do is iron it from the back. So you'll want to lay this down on something padded, like a folded up towel would work real well. And then you'll want to iron it with steam on the back here. And just gently press it, and I use the point of the iron to maybe get some of the wrinkles that are around the edges. And then that will preserve the way the stitches look. Before we wrap up, I'd like to talk about some of the beautiful embroidery books that are at the Davenport Library. This first one is called Beautiful Botanical Embroidery by Alice Makabe. Then here's Modern Embroidery Studio. This one is by Lauren Holton. Here's Modern Embroidery. This one's by Laura Strutt. Look at all those French knots. Once you master your French knots, you can create a rainbow hoop like this one. And then this one is called Empowered Embroidery. It's by Amy Frazer, and it's embroideries of strong, iconic women. So very unusual, but very beautiful. I know that there are more coming out this spring. There's a beautiful one by Emily Ferris coming out called Thread Painting, which is when you use very fine threads and very detailed to make very realistic paintings with embroidery. And there's another one by Arona Konaraj, who you may remember from our Visible Mending class, wrote the book Visible Mending. She has one coming out on embroidery later this spring. So I'm really looking forward to those. There's lots more available as well. So be sure and stop by and check out our different offerings. All the information about these books will be in the notes down below, so you can get your reserves in and take a look at these and be even further inspired. I hope you enjoyed our series here on stitching and that it inspired you to try some yourself. If you do make something, we'd love to see what you come up with. Just tag us at #DavenportLibrary. If you have any questions, be sure to contact me. My email address is listed in the end credits here. And until then, happy stitching.